It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the noise of everyday life. A weekend trip, just a few friends, a campfire, and the wilderness to unwind in. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cool night air settled in, things began to change. The stillness of the forest that should have been comforting instead grew heavy with an unseen tension. Something was waiting, something out there, just beyond the trees. You think you know what it's like to be alone in nature. Familiar sounds, rustling leaves, a distant owl calling. The usual sounds of the forest are often a comfort, a reminder of the earth's pulse. But what if those sounds aren't what you think? What if, in the middle of the night, those noises weren't just animals going about their business, but something far more dangerous? That's the exact question one group of campers found themselves grappling with when a quiet night in the woods turned into a desperate fight for survival. As night fell and the temperature dropped, the campers began to notice strange sounds coming from the trees. It was subtle at first, a crackling in the underbrush, a low growl in the distance. They laughed it off, attributing it to the usual wild creatures. But with each passing hour, the sounds grew louder. They couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every crack of a branch, every wind-swept whisper, sent their minds racing. The night was supposed to be peaceful, just a break from the rush of the world. But the closer the darkness crept, the more unsettled they became. There was something out there, something big. It wasn't just a bear passing by, casually sniffing around. No, this was deliberate. This was something with purpose. It wasn't wind, it wasn't rain. Someone, or something, was knocking. And that's when it hit them. The reality of their situation began to sink in. They were miles from the nearest help, and in the wilderness, you're not always the predator. Sometimes, you're the prey. As the knocking grew louder, more insistent, a question began to echo in their minds. What if we're the ones being hunted? This is the true story of the night a bear came knocking. The sun hung low in the sky as we began to set up our camp. The woods around us were picturesque, majestic trees with thick trunks, their branches creating a dense canopy overhead. It was the kind of place that looked straight out of a travel magazine, the perfect picture of serenity. The scent of pine was fresh in the air, and the earthy, damp smell of the forest ground added to the sense of tranquility. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor as we unpacked our gear and spread out around the campsite. The fire pit was right in the center, a ring of stones carefully arranged to contain the fire we'd light later. We had enough dry wood stacked beside it to last through the night. The crackling sound of twigs breaking underfoot as we gathered kindling filled the air, adding to the sense of normalcy. It was a beautiful evening, and there was nothing unusual about the setting. The peace of the forest was palpable, and we basked in it. One of my friends, Michael, had brought his guitar, and soon enough, the light-hearted strumming of folk songs began to fill the air. Laughter echoed as we swapped stories, reminiscing about our previous camping trips. It was easy to fall into a rhythm, easy to forget that we were deep in the wilderness, miles from civilization. The world outside this small circle of light seemed distant, irrelevant. For a while, it felt like nothing could disturb the stillness around us. We cooked a simple meal over the fire, hot dogs and roasted marshmallows, nothing fancy. But there was a sense of satisfaction that came with it. We ate, chatted, and joked, unaware that the night was already shifting, that the peacefulness of the woods was about to unravel. As the last of the sunlight began to slip away behind the trees, the atmosphere subtly changed. The firelight grew brighter, casting flickering shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally long across the forest floor. I glanced up at the sky. It was clear, the stars now visible in their vast expanse, but there was something about the air that felt off. It wasn't cold, but there was a weight to the night, an oppressive stillness that hung over us like a dark cloud. The sounds of the forest, which had been comforting earlier, had started to fade. The chirping of crickets was gone. The soft rustling of leaves in the wind seemed to disappear. The occasional owl call, once so steady, was no longer heard. It was as if all the nocturnal creatures of the woods had vanished, leaving us in an eerie silence. I could hear the soft crunch of the firewood as the flames consumed it, But beyond that, nothing. Not even the wind. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I heard something. It was faint at first, like a rustling, but it was more deliberate. It sounded like something large, too large for a squirrel or rabbit. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind moving the branches, or maybe a deer making its way through the woods. But there was something unnerving about it. The way it stopped and started. The way it moved closer to the camp without any sound of leaves crunching underfoot. I looked around at my friends. They were still laughing and talking, oblivious to the sound. I wanted to tell them about it, but I didn't want to ruin the mood. Besides, I kept reminding myself that it was just the woods, playing tricks on my mind. I took a deep breath, and we carried on as if nothing had changed. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The shadows around us seemed to grow longer, stretching into the night, swallowing the trees and the surrounding underbrush. And then, just as I was about to push the thoughts from my mind, I heard it again. A rustling, closer this time. The kind of movement that was too heavy, too deliberate to be from a harmless animal. The sound of something much larger making its way through the undergrowth. My eyes scanned the edge of the camp, where the trees met the clearing, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was moving just out of sight. But all I saw was darkness. The rustling stopped for a moment, and in that silence, I could hear something else, an odd, unsettling pressure in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. And then, it came again, louder this time, the sound of something big moving close, too close. And then, there it was, the unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing through the bushes, a large, weighty thud that reverberated through the ground, followed by the unmistakable sound of branches snapping. My heart skipped a beat, and my hand instinctively reached for the flashlight at my side. The others hadn't noticed yet, still caught in their own conversation. The fire crackled, the flames dancing higher, but they didn't seem to reach the edges of the clearing, where the shadows had begun to grow darker. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled deep in my chest. It could have been anything, right? A bear, a deer, something natural. But as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that we were no longer alone out here. I wasn't sure if my mind was playing tricks on me, but in the farthest corner of my vision, I saw something. Just a fleeting shadow, barely more than a ripple in the night. My breath hitched, and for a split second, I thought I had imagined it. But no, there it was again. A large figure, darker than the trees around it, moving just beyond the edge of the campfire's glow. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes darted across the clearing, searching for something. Anything that would explain what I had just seen. Was it a bear? Maybe a shadow cast by the wind? The trees around us were thick, and the darkness was consuming everything at the edges. But I couldn't shake the sense that whatever it was watching us. I could feel the weight of those unseen eyes, bearing down on me from the dark. Was that just the wind? Or something more? I whispered to myself, my breath coming faster. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I couldn't bring myself to speak the words aloud. The others, still deep in conversation, hadn't noticed. They were unaware of the tension that was rising in my chest, the creeping fear that threatened to paralyze me. I quickly tried to push the thought away, telling myself that it was nothing, just the forest playing tricks on my mind. But as I took a step back to join the others, I caught another brief glimpse of the shadow, this time closer, just out of the reach of the firelight. It was larger, moving with an almost predatory grace. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone in this clearing anymore. And then, as if to confirm my deepest fear, I heard it. A soft growl, low, rumbling. It was distant, but unmistakable. It was a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, that primal fear clawing its way into my chest. The others didn't seem to hear it, or if they did, they didn't acknowledge it. They were still talking, laughing as if the woods were just another backdrop to our adventures. But I couldn't ignore it. I stood up, my body rigid with tension. The rustling had stopped for a moment, but the growl was still there, lingering in the air, vibrating through the ground beneath us. My flashlight was shaking in my hand as I scanned the darkness, but all I could see were trees and shadows. I felt the growing isolation of being surrounded by nothing but trees, the weight of the wilderness pressing in on us, reminding us that we were small in comparison to what lay beyond our camp. There was no escape, no way to outrun what was out there. We were exposed, and it was getting closer. I glanced over at Sarah, who had gone silent, her eyes darting toward the woods, her posture stiff with tension. She met my gaze, her expression mirroring my own fear. She was just as unnerved as I was, and I could tell she knew something was wrong. She stood up quickly, excusing herself with a muttered phrase about checking the tents, but I knew she wasn't fooling anyone. She was as scared as I was. I watched as she stepped away from the firelight, her figure disappearing into the shadows, moving toward the tent where the rest of our gear was. I couldn't help but feel a surge of panic as she disappeared into the dark. Every part of me wanted to stop her, to shout at her to come back, but the words never left my throat. It was as though I couldn't speak, couldn't break the tension that was thickening around us. Seconds felt like hours as I waited. The sound of footsteps crunching on dry leaves reached my ears, followed by a soft, eerie sound. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was knocking on the ground far from us. My eyes widened in horror as I recognized the sound. It was no longer just the rustling of leaves, no longer just the growl. Now, there was knocking, deliberate and rhythmic, as though someone were standing just outside our campsite, tapping on the ground. Sarah stumbled back into the camp, her face pale, her breath shallow. "It's close," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. "Something's out there." She didn't need to say more. We all know now. It wasn't just a bear. It wasn't just a curious animal. Whatever was out there was big, too big to be ignored. And it was too close. We huddled together, now fully aware of the danger. Our eyes stayed fixed on the shadows, our ears straining to pick up any sound. The knock was followed by another growl, louder now and closer. It sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was something more terrifying. I grabbed the flashlight again, pointing it toward the edge of the clearing, where the trees stood like silent sentinels. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, as if in slow motion, the beam of light caught something. Something huge moving just beyond the trees. The shape was massive, dark, and unmistakable. A bear, its silhouette clear in the dim light. But this wasn't just a bear casually walking by. This was a bear standing at the edge of the campsite, its massive form outlined by the flickering glow of the fire. It was staring at us. Its eyes glinted with a hunger that made my blood run cold. Its claws scraped against the ground as it took a step forward, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The rest of the group stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The bear didn't charge, didn't show any overt signs of aggression, but it was there. It was close. And the uncertainty of what to do next was paralyzing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my body tensed, ready to run or fight. I wasn't sure which. The others were whispering, but their words were lost in the roar of adrenaline that filled my ears. I wanted to shout, to tell them to get inside the tents, to hide, but I couldn't form the words. All I could do was stare at the bear, my mind racing. Would it attack? Would it leave us alone? The bear's large form loomed closer to the camp, its massive paws crunching the dry leaves beneath it. The night felt so still, yet everything around us was alive with the sound of that growl, that low, rumbling sound that promised violence. The bear moved closer and closer to the campsite, closer to where we stood, and I knew at that moment we had to make a decision. What would you do in this situation? Would you try to fight back, or would you hide and pray that the bear would lose interest? The tension in the air was almost unbearable, the quiet of the night now replaced by the growing weight of fear. Every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing faster. And then, the unmistakable sound. The bear started knocking again. It wasn't as subtle as before. This time, the knocks were sharp, aggressive. Each strike against the ground was louder, more insistent. Clawing, scraping, and a deep thud that vibrated through the ground, making the very earth feel alive with threat. My breath caught in my throat. It was no longer just curiosity from the bear. This was something else, a warning, a demand. The animal was trying to reach us. The knocks were deliberate, rhythmic, like it was testing our defenses. And I couldn't help but think that it wasn't just curious, it was angry. We huddled together in the center of the campsite, whispering frantically, our voices shaky with fear. No one knew what to do. No one had ever planned for this kind of situation. We could hear the bears breathing now, deep, heavy, right outside. The sound of it was unnervingly close. Each breath felt like it was coming from within, as if the bear was inches away, listening, waiting. The ground shook. I'm not sure if it was from the bear's weight or the wind, but it was enough to make my heart jump in my chest. The air outside was thick with tension, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples. Every crack of the fire was like a loud scream in the otherwise suffocating silence. The only light now seemed to come from the small glow of the campfire. The shadows in the trees seemed to grow, stretching toward us, as if they too were closing in. We scrambled to stay as quiet as possible, our bodies pressed against each other. The bear was relentless. It had moved closer, its massive body brushing against the woods. I wanted to scream, wanted to do anything to break the suffocating silence. But every instinct told me that if I moved, if I made even the slightest noise, it would hear us. One of the guys, James, couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't stand in the campsite, waiting for the bear to tear through it. "I'll check it out," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Stay here. Don't make a sound." Against my better judgment, I nodded. I watched as he crawled out of the campsite, so slowly, so carefully. His flashlight cut through the darkness, but it was only a faint beam, barely reaching beyond the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, and then the silence returned. The sounds of the forest were completely gone. The only thing that remained was the pounding of my heart. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, there was a crash, a loud thump against the ground. James screamed. My heart started racing, adrenaline flooding my system. "James!" I shouted, but my voice cracked, drowned out by the growl that rumbled through the night. James stumbled back into the campsite, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. It was right there. It was right in front of me. His breath came in quick, ragged gasps. "We're not alone." Just when we thought things couldn't get any worse, something terrifying happened. From the other side of the camp, where the trees were thick and the shadows deep, there came another growl. But this one was different. It was louder, more guttural, and it echoed through the trees like a challenge. The bear wasn't alone, and suddenly, the fear that had been gnawing at me turned into full-blown terror. The growl was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footfalls, thumping through the brush, louder and closer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had we somehow angered a group of bears? Or was there something else out there? Something worse than we could imagine? My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the ground beneath us vibrating with every step. There was more than one creature out there, and we were caught in the middle of it. And then, the worst sound of all, distant screams. A desperate, chilling cry, echoing from a neighboring campsite. The scream was cut off abruptly, and then there was only silence. The fear that had been building in us all suddenly rushed to the surface. We weren't the only ones out here. There were others, and they were in danger. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." But it was too late. The nightmare wasn't just at our campsite anymore. It was spreading. We made the decision to leave. There was no choice. We couldn't stay out here any longer. The campsite, once a place of peace, had turned into a war zone. The noise was constant now. The growls, the crashing through the woods, the sense that we were being hunted. Every step we took felt like it could be our last. We quickly packed up our gear, fumbling in the dark, unable to think clearly, just reacting. The forest around us felt alive with danger. We hurried down the narrow trail, our feet pounding against the forest floor. The sound of branches snapping underfoot was deafening in the otherwise quiet night. My thoughts were clouded with fear, my mind unable to focus on anything but the one overwhelming thought: get out. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was closing in. Every rustle in the trees, Every movement in the shadows sent a jolt of panic through my body. It wasn't just the bear anymore. It was something worse, something we had never expected. And as we moved further into the forest, I kept wondering, what if it's too late? What if we don't make it out alive? I couldn't stop the thoughts from flooding my mind, the images of the bear's glowing eyes, the screams from the other campsite, the feeling that we were being pursued. I thought back to the peacefulness of the day, to the excitement of setting up camp, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret. How could we have been so blind? How could we have thought we were safe? As we hiked deeper into the woods, the sounds of the forest grew louder, but they weren't the sounds of nature. No, these were the sounds of something much more dangerous. Heavy footsteps echoed behind us, growing closer with every step. My heart pounded harder, my legs aching as we pushed forward. And then it came, the low growl, the unmistakable sound of the bear, just behind us, its footsteps echoing in the distance. But this time, it wasn't alone. The growl wasn't just one. It was a chorus of growls, the sound of multiple creatures closing in. I turned to look back, just for a second, and saw a fleeting image. A shadow in the trees, eyes gleaming in the darkness. It was too much. We had to run. We didn't stop, didn't look back. The sound of the bear's claws on the forest floor was closer now, like it was right behind us. We were almost out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't going to make it. Not all of us. Not with whatever was out there. We made it out, eventually. Our hearts still racing, our minds replaying the horrors of that night. I still hear the sound of that bear's claws every time I close my eyes. That night's terror will haunt me forever. And to this day, I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't made it out alive. What about you? Have you ever had a terrifying experience like this in the wild? Share your story below. I want to hear it. And if you want more chilling true stories, don't forget to subscribe. The next nightmare could be closer than you think.